solar. And have you got the slides running there, Amanda? There we go. Okay. I'll start by giving you a little background on just who I am and my experience with solar, but then I'm going to talk a little bit about the equipment that's in a solar project, particularly the solar panels. That's what people are usually most interested in, and talk about some common concerns. And then, of course, toward the later part of the event, I'll be available to help answer questions as well. But I'm an engineer by training. I've spent all my life in North Carolina, and my full career in solar. And that started about a dozen years at the university here, North Carolina State University. And North Carolina was one of the first states to see a pretty significant amount of utility scale solar development. And that happened while I was at the university. And we were developing a lot of smaller projects in the state. And so there was lots of projects all across the state, and a lot of questions from those communities where the projects were going in, coming to our group at the university as kind of the solar group at the university. So I got a lot of questions about what are the concerns communities should have or might have about these systems. And so I've been looking deeply into these questions for about at least 12 years now. And while I was at the university, I wrote a very in-depth white paper, kind of a public education paper on these questions of health and safety impacts. And since then, I've been presenting nationally across the country on questions about health and safety impacts. My day job, though, is a solar engineer at a small nonprofit energy consulting company, and we work primarily for electric utilities. Electric utility will hire us to come in and commission solar projects as they're being built. So we'll inspect construction and also do review of their controls that operate the project. So I've got a lot of field experience being on the ground as these projects are being built and put into practice. So what I'm going to talk about today to start off with is just the components of a solar project. The majority of what you would see if you're walking around a project are just rows of solar panels. And then this other equipment is really just very small footprint for the other equipment. The solar panels are not a new technology. It's the same basic technology that's been implemented for the last 50 years. And we'll talk a little more in depth about the solar panels themselves on the next slide. They're all mounted on what the industry calls a racking system. Those could either be a fixed tilt rack, where they just permanently tilted toward the south, or more commonly now is a one-axis tracker, where that system slowly rotates automatically across the day to follow the path of the sun, starting out facing east, by the end of the day is facing west. And then the main other piece of equipment in the whole project are inverters that convert the DC electricity the panels produce into a grid synced AC electricity. And those are fairly large, usually mounted on a concrete pad or maybe on a steel platform sitting on some piers. You can think of them roughly as the size of a golf cart, something similar to that, depending on the manufacturer. And then right beside that inverter will be a transformer to bump up the voltage coming out of the inverter. And those are just a very small footprint spread around the project. Usually they are 3 to 5 megawatt per inverter. So for simple math, if you had a 100 megawatt site and 5 megawatt inverters, you would have about 20 of those inverters spread around the project, usually fairly centrally located in a group of panels that are all feeding into that inverter. And then there'll be a substation for a project, and that substation boosts the voltage again higher to connect to the transmission grid. So there you'll have one large transformer and some circuit breakers and other support equipment. That's really not any different particularly than other kind of substation that you'll see around the community that would just be existing in the utility infrastructure. And then, as you've heard described already, that power goes directly into the transmission system. There's no batteries required on site or elsewhere. As that electricity is produced, it naturally goes out and immediately finds the nearest loads that it's able to serve. If you would move to the next slide, we'll look a little more in depth at a typical photovoltaic panel, or usually just referred to as for short PV. There's really two primary technologies that these panels can use. They're both photovoltaic technologies, but that material can be made out of different compounds. Most commonly is a silicon-based PV material, and that's what's shown in this slide. And the majority of utility scale projects and more or less 100% of rooftop projects use silicon-based panels. But there is another technology, sometimes referred to as thin film, but it's specifically a cadmium telluride is what the cell is made of. And that's effectively made just by one manufacturer, First Solar. So you may also hear it referred to as a First Solar module. And those are somewhat common in the utility scale industry, but not nearly as common as the silicon-based cells. But for both technologies, the construction of the panels are very similar. Really a tiny fraction of the weight of the panel is the cell itself. Most of the panel is there to protect those cells for that long life, sitting out in the weather for decades. So about 80% of the weight is a tempered glass front and then aluminum frame for rigidity and to give you a way to mount that panel. They're roughly about 3.5 feet wide, 7.5 feet tall, and weigh about 50 pounds. And again, most all of that weight is just that protective glass cover. The next most significant weight is plastic. There's encapsulation layers. That's a clear plastic film above and below the cells to keep moisture away from those cells for their entire life. And that, in almost all cases, that material is EVA. It's a very common plastic used in thousands of consumer products. And it's also used in windshield glass. This is basically the same way an auto windshield glass is made. That EVA is a waterproof layer, and if the glass does ever break, it keeps those little pieces of glass all attached, and in many cases can still remain waterproof even with the broken glass. And then you have tiny bits of metal that are in here to conduct away the electricity from those cells to two wires that come out the back. And that metal is largely copper. There's some silver, and then there's solder that's mostly tin. There's a mixture of tin and lead. And then you have these two wires that are copper wires coming out the back that are obviously insulated. And so of all those materials, you can see there's no liquids. It's all very common construction materials and consumer product materials. The only material of any of that has any health or safety concern is that tiny bit of lead in the solder. And this has been typical of solar panel construction for decades now. So there's many decades of field experience and research on these panels, and no worry about the risk of that lead getting out into the environment because of all those things I said. It's a super durable glass cover. The plastic layers seal it away from moisture, and then there's just a tiny bit of lead there. Studies that have been done, we'll go to the next slide, we can talk about these risks more specifically on these top two items here. This is a toxicity bullet and a broken PV panel bullet. There's been a number of studies, both physical tests and then also more of academic simulations of worst case scenarios of could this lead get out, how bad could it be? And the worst case scenario anybody can think of is it's not possible for that that led to have a negative impact on human health. There's just too little there, and it's too hard to get out. The panels are able to just go directly into a landfill, and there's standardized testing to determine that they're non-hazardous waste, so they can go into a landfill. The last two bullets here, other common concerns are fire and EMF, or sometimes just referred to as radiation. On the fire front, it's certainly possible to have an electrical short in the panels or other parts of the wiring of the project, but by and large, the equipment's just not flammable. The insulation on the wire is flammable, those few plastic layers are flammable. So when you have an electrical fault, it doesn't spread. It generally will burn out that equipment right there until it has burned out enough material that the fault goes away, or that arc goes away, and it's a non-issue. There's thousands of large utility scale systems now across the country and across the world, and fire has not been an issue at the projects. They can exist, but they're easy to maintain. The fires are, and they largely just self-extinguish with very limited impact. EMF refers to electromagnetic fields that occur anytime you have electricity. All of these solar panels and the wiring between them creates DC electricity, and there's essentially no EMF associated with those. It's the AC electricity that has a 60 hertz frequency associated with it, just like all electricity and utility wires, as well as wiring in homes and powering devices, has some EMF associated with it. Largely the scientific thinking is there's not any health and safety concern at all with that EMF. But regardless, the EMF generated by the solar equipment would never reach anybody outside the project. It would really be isolated to the vicinity of the inverters, the transformers, then the substation. But those fields don't extend very far from the equipment, so people, even next door neighbors to the project, would not experience any additional EMF. All right, and briefly, I'd like to move to the last slide to conclude with what I'd like to cover, and certainly I'll be available for questions later. In thinking about the operations of the project, they're really automatically controlled. They have automatic control systems for those various aspects of the project, and remote monitoring. So there are groups that are constantly monitoring a solar plant like this, just like there's groups that are constantly monitoring other types of power plants. These power plants are constantly monitored. And these trackers that move the panels throughout the day are automatic, primarily moving based on time where the sun is, but they also have sensors across the project that are sensing wind and solar conditions and rain and snow conditions, and so they will automatically adjust. If it's windy, they will rotate to respond to that wind to minimize wind forces. If it's heavy rain or heavy snow, they have different protocols. If it's a situation where there's hail predicted, they will turn to the most steep angle, which should avoid hail damage. When they turn, they can turn almost vertical, at least close to vertical, and avoid hail damage. And they can also turn very vertical to avoid snow loading. And then there's manual overrides that the controllers can use to make those same kind of adjustments if the automatic system isn't well enough aware of the weather. So there's a lot more I can address in questions, but I don't want to take more time now, and I appreciate that time to present. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tommy. Really appreciate it. Now we have Pete Berthelsen that will be speaking, and Pete's going to share his screen via Zoom because he has some transitions that I can't control on this, so it's easier for you to just look at that screen if possible.
Yep. Are you able to see my screen now?
Yes.
All right. Thank you. Well, here we go. This will be a quick introduction, and I just want to start the introduction by telling you who I am. I'm coming to you tonight from central Nebraska, beautiful part of the world we call the Loess Hills. I'm actually a farmer and a rancher. Little aerial view of our operation. But at its core, what I am is a wildlife biologist that has spent my career designing, establishing, and managing vegetation. And so that's where I come into the picture with our conversation tonight. And I just want to pretty briefly go through what some of the key considerations are regarding vegetative success and how we can use vegetation on a utility scale solar project to deliver a lot of multiple environmental benefits. And I'm going to chat just a little bit about those. And I'm going to start by showing you this screen. This is actually shows where the utility scale solar projects are in 2024 that Conservation Blueprint is working with. And obviously Indiana is one of the real hotbeds in the nation of where projects are happening. But I show you this image on this screen to make this point. This project that you're here tonight to learn more about is a really, really unique project. But the questions and the thoughts and the things that you want to know about or the concerns that you have related to soil health, erosion, water quality, stormwater runoff, how can we have multiple environmental benefits? Those are not unique. Those are asked on every single one of these utility scale solar project questions that we work on across the country. And this is where we kind of think that we come to this with a unique perspective and a unique level of expertise to think about how multiple environmental benefits can be delivered. So just very quickly, some, not all, but some of the multiple environmental benefits that a project like this and the other utility scale solar projects in Indiana are thinking about are things like I've kind of already mentioned. Soil health. How can we make sure we're reducing soil erosion? We're improving water quality. We're thinking about things like carbon sequestration, water percolation. How do we move water that comes onto the system instead of it running off along the top of the ground? How we get it to move into the ground. Pollinator health and habitat, setting the area up where it's performing as a wildlife corridor that can connect different pieces of habitat that are out there. And things like agrovoltaics. How can agriculture still be a part of a utility scale solar project? So these are just some of the things that are considered that could be an objective and an environmental benefit deliverable as part of this project that we have here. And just like every solar project has a code for wiring, how the solar panels are made, how panels are attached, how many torque pounds of pressure is on a bolt, there is a plan for how the vegetation is prepared, established, and then managed on a site. And that's called a vegetation management plan. And a vegetation management plan will talk about lots and lots and lots of things, but it will talk about how to prepare a site, how to plant it, when to plant it, what a seed mixture is, when cover crop options should be used, what the management is in the first couple of years, lots of very detailed information. And that vegetation management plan is designed uniquely for each individual project that's out there and contains lots and lots of very detailed information about what should be done to produce the vegetative outcome that we want on that project. And again, this is very unique and critically important to deliver the environmental objectives that we might want with this project. And then every project will have a very unique seed mixture that's designed to fit all of these objectives that happen out there. And a vegetation management plan, as I mentioned, will say when you can plant, what kind of methodology you can use to plant, how management will be applied to the site, particularly in the first year when there has a significant opportunity of being a lot of weeds that show up on the site. When do we mow? How do we mow? What height do we mow at? All of that kind of general information is in there. And then most of the utility scale solar projects that are out there, particularly the ones that we work on in the state of Indiana, take a unique approach of using 2 different seed mixtures on a project. And as you're looking at this picture, this is a real world project. Now the area that's kind of in the pink or the mauve color is the area inside the project fence where there are panels and where we have designed a seed mixture to not grow any taller than what the lower panel height is above the ground. So the vegetation will not grow tall enough that it produces any shading on the lower panel height. In the green areas of this project, that could be both inside the project fence and or outside the project fence, these projects develop what we call a buffer area seed mixture. It's kind of a very traditional pollinator habitat seed mixture, a minimum of 40 wildflower species in it. Can grow to lots of different heights because there are no panels there. And using this 2 seed mixture approach works really, really well to provide key environmental benefits. And in a state like Indiana, where Purdue has developed this thing called the Indiana Solar Site Pollinator Habitat Planning Scorecard. It's a long name, but it is a scorecard that develops a score that provides helps to determine whether a utility scale solar project is providing good pollinator health and habitat outcomes. This 2 seed mixture approach that I just demonstrated to you has on average in the state of Indiana producing a score of 115, and that is well into the approved range of being designated as providing pollinator habitat benefits. But there's really other things that we can do in addition to pollinator health and habitat. Certainly we can be providing benefits for honeybees. These projects can be a key spot to locate commercial beehives and impact US sourced honey production. But it can also be a habitat that is critically important for things like monarch butterfly, which in December has a high likelihood of being listed as an endangered species. The most iconically recognized insect species in the country has the potential to be listed as an endangered species on December 4th of this year. Utility scale solar projects can provide some of the key critical habitat components for a species like this. Soil health can be a really important consideration that a project can help deliver. And there is not a way that we can stick a probe in the ground that says yes or no, you have good soil health. But we look at 4 indicators that are representative of soil health by looking at the soil organic matter, the physical structure of the soil, the chemical structure of the soil, and the biological structure of the soil. We can monitor and document improvements and the quality of the soil health. And that will be a really important and unique opportunity with utility scale solar. Last couple of things is that things like grassland birds have experienced over the past 40 years the population declines, in some cases of in the 90% decline. And projects like this, hard to believe, but solar projects that are planting vast amounts of grass habitat can also provide critically important and missing habitat for grassland species like this. And I'll just finish, and then I'll turn it back to Amanda and the team there, that this is a unique opportunity that Orion is very interested in how to deliver and maintain multiple environmental benefits. And I will be here the rest of the night to answer your questions that might come up related to that. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Pete. Really appreciate it. Now we have Nick Kirkland on the line to present regarding property values. Nick?
Yes, good evening. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. My name is Nick Kirkland with Kirkland Appraisals. I'm a state certified general appraiser in the state of Indiana as well as several other states. I've been accepted as an expert in property value impacts for boards of commissioners, town councils, and the like hundreds of times regarding solar facilities and other special use permits. In addition, I'm a candidate for designation with the Appraisal Institute. If you'd like to, could you go on to the next page for me? Thank you. So what I'm going to be talking to you about this evening is what are solar farms and their relation to property values. Excuse me. So first, what I'd like to discuss, could you go to the next slide, please? I'd like to discuss what's called an externality, or some facet or characteristic of a property that could cause it to impact another property. So examples of this I'm going to go through and kind of discuss how solar fits in relatively briefly. First, there's hazardous materials, which has already been covered as not being something present regarding a solar facility and therefore not potentially impactful. The second most common one that gets discussed regarding property values and what would impact the neighbors would be noise. But as Michael has already discussed, noise is not really a factor regarding solar facilities and therefore is unlikely to impact adjoining property values. Next is traffic. Traffic for a finished solar facility is relatively minimal, with most of the trips being solely for maintenance and vegetative buffers as well as repairs. Typically, several single-family dwellings will have more vehicle trips in a month than one solar facility. So if you take any country road with a couple houses on it, that's about as much traffic as you would expect from a finished solar facility, given that it's not really a traffic generator, it's not a destination, people aren't going there to shop or anything like that. So there's not a basis for an impact there. The next one is odor. There is no specific odor associated with solar facilities and therefore no impact to neighboring property values. And that leads us to the last two. The question being, well, if there would be an impact from the solar facility on a neighbor's property value, what would cause it? Well, it's typically appearance or for uses that have a stigma. So to briefly discuss stigma, a stigma is where there is a cross-market negative perception of a use. Examples are often adult establishments, correctional facilities, and sometimes rehabilitation centers. What this means is there is a measurable impact to the property values of uses directly adjacent to these types of uses, and not just in one scenario, but consistently there's a pattern of that because there's something less desirable about living next to such a use. We have significant matched pair data that I'll be discussing shortly that shows that stigma is not a concern regarding solar facilities. So what that means is if there is an impact to adjoining property values, it's due to the appearance. And the most common thing that gets brought up at community meetings and board meetings is, well, I don't necessarily mind the solar facility, but I don't want my view to change. I don't want to look at it. How do we fix that? And so typically developers are using vegetative buffers or landscaping screens. They'll use larger setbacks to use the curve of the earth to hide the panels as best as possible. And that used with vegetative buffers goes a very long way because panels are not that tall. They have a similar profile and appearance to a greenhouse. And the third way that developers tend to mitigate the appearance externality is using like a landscaping cloth or landscaping screening attached to the fence. So with that in mind, if you don't mind going to the next slide, please, I'd like to discuss what we do at Kirkland Appraisals. It's called a matched pair analysis. So what I'm going to do is walk you through a hypothetical example after I explain what this is, and then talk to you about some of the research that we've done. So a matched pair or a paired sales analysis is where you compare a property that is sold adjacent to a specific use, in this case a solar facility, and you compare that to several, typically 3, nearby properties that are very similar, and you're trying to find out, is the property next to the solar facility selling for less, more, or about the same as the other similar nearby properties? So in this example, you can see that there is a red arrow pointing at a property that's sold hypothetically next to this solar facility. When trying to determine whether or not it sold at a typical price or whether the solar facility had an impact, we might look at other nearby sales. In this example, let's assume those 3 with green arrows pointed at them have also sold. After typical adjustments such as age, or if there is a slightly different date of sale, condition of the improvements, and the like, we're trying to determine, well, is there an impact? Did the property with the red arrow pointed at it sell for more, less, or about the same? If you could go to the next slide, please. So an important factor in doing a matched pair analysis is not stopping there. It's not that difficult to find nearby sales, say, yes, this sold for more, or this sold for less, and the impact is positive, whatever percent, or negative this, but it doesn't always tell the whole story. So the most important thing is reaching out to the buyer or seller's agent to ask, hey, when you were listing this property or when you purchased this property, did you pay less for it because it's adjacent to a solar facility? Was the list price different than what it otherwise would have been because it's next to a solar facility? Or was the marketing, did it take longer to sell? These are important things to reach out and ask, and without actually doing that to confirm, it's difficult to utilize just the matched pair on its own. Additionally, real estate is an imperfect market, and the best example of this would be looking at a cookie cutter neighborhood where it's going to be the same developer building the same type of house, similar square footage, same size lot, and looking, hey, are all of the houses selling for the same value? Well, no, because that's not how real estate works. It's imperfect, and some people prefer to be on the corner, some don't. Sometimes a developer wants to sell something at the end of the month, and at the end of the day, that's just inherent in real estate. And that's part of where we talk about real estate is imperfect. So when discussing matched pairs, if they say negative 5% to the adjoining property value or positive 5% to the adjoining property value, these are both strong indications of no impact to the adjoining property's value. And another way to look or think about this is if you ever have your house or your property appraised, if you look at the comparable sales that they utilize, the difference between the highest comparable and the lowest comparable is typically more than 5% because real estate is imperfect. And lastly, it's very important to have additional examples. Having one example that says negative 10% and 15 examples that say positive 10% and cherry picking one of those is not representing what's actually happening. So whenever we're discussing our findings, we're always showing everything. Those that show a potential negative, those that show a potential positive, and then the vast majority would show significantly no impact to adjoining property values. If you could go to the next slide, please. There's 4 typical university studies that get brought up in regards to property values that I'd like to touch on briefly. The first is the University of Texas at Austin. This is a study that was a survey of appraisers and assessors asking in a hypothetical scenario, what impact do you think a solar facility would have on adjoining properties' values? The overall conclusion of the study was